Turn it on. There we go. Today it's a little longer lesson. They seem to be getting increasingly longer as we go through Lent. This particular lesson, for the gospel lesson in particular for the fourth Sunday of Lent, is yet another major theme during our Lenten readings in the A cycle. We've been through the temptations, which is always the theme of the first Sunday in Lent. And then we heard about the idea of the Spirit being born again, of water and the Spirit, in the conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus. Nicodemus coming at night, our sort of mnemonic Nick at night kind of idea. And then we had the conversation about water, the theme of water on the third Sunday in Lent. Jesus having his conversation with the woman at the well, which we had last week. And now on this fourth Sunday in Lent, we have the theme of light, the theme of vision coming forward, because the gospel lesson, this rather lengthy lesson we're going to look at, is the story that is related to us in John's gospel that we sort of give the title, The Man Born Blind. And so we kind of will look at that in some detail today. So we're going to start that. Let's see here. Let's go to our screen share. It's not quite right here. I got to fix something. Bear with me one moment. Oh, there's Judith. Good. Yeah, yay. All right. Now I think we're ready. Yeah, there we go. All right, we'll do our screen share so we can look at, still not quite what I want. Something's my computer did an update, and you know what happens when that happens is things aren't the way they're supposed to be. I don't want that view. Okay, now maybe it'll work. There we go. So you should be looking at the home page of our website. Drag this over here because it's in the way. And we're going to go to the, here we go. The lessons for the day. There's the first lesson from Samuel. And we'll go immediately to the gospel because it is a rather long and lengthy lesson. So we'll get to it right away. It comes to us from the 9th chapter of John. And it begins, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. Now that's significant. I'll just stop there for a moment and just say that. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents that he was born blind? And Jesus answered them, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. Now the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? And some were saying, it is he. And others were saying, no, but it is someone like him. He kept saying, I am the man. But they kept asking him, then how were your eyes opened? And he answered, why, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and received my sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I do not know. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. And he said, he's a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? And his parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. Now his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, but though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Oh, then they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. And the man answered, here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And then they answered him, you were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us? And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees nearby heard him say this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains." Here ends the lesson. Now, what say you?
Can do many sermons out of this passage.
So tell me what I should say.
Probably the one thing that caught my attention when I was rereading the passage today was the topic of blind from birth and was born blind, or was it the parents? So obviously there's some religious tradition there that was in the way of the interpretation, and we see that playing through the passage, how the way we have learned to interpret things become a conflict with the new realities or the new experience we have in front of us. And how do we play with that? How do we take what seemed to be strange and new?
Okay. Something outside our comfort zone.
The Pharisees are convinced that if something bad happens to a person, they must have sinned.
Mhm.
And now they have this conundrum of a person born blind. So they can't get away from that thing. So the parents must have sinned to get this. And so they're stuck in this rut. And they're trying to somehow or other find something wrong with it. And this poor blind man, who is obviously very intelligent, tries in vain to explain his experience. And his conclusion is correct, but they can't accept that. And they stumble over this thing of Jesus doing this on the Sabbath. Therefore, it couldn't be a good thing. And he's turning their world upside down.
Mhm, mhm. Well, so you've got several things going on there. I mean, you just really pointed out a number of different things at the same time. It was a common worldview, because notice who asks the first question. Whose sin was this the result of? Who asks that question? It's Jesus' disciples who asked that question. So it's not just the Pharisees, it was the common religious belief of the time that an unfortunate set of circumstances in life, being poor, being ill, disease of any sort, intractable disease, blindness, deafness, being lame, and so on, that these were all the result of divine judgment against sin and evil. And so the concept of curse and blessing comes in here, that these misfortunes in life were interpreted as curses from God. And so that the opposite of that, good health, good fortune, being lots of children, being barren, for example, that terminology, excuse that terminology, but that was what was used in the scriptures. that was seen as a curse from God, that somehow you were had engaged in or were impacted by some sort of unfortunate participation in evil. And so that this was God's divine judgment. And Jesus is in the process of upending that tradition. So we hear this several times through the gospel. This is a very specific, in this particular case, he confronts this tradition head on. And he actually says it was neither. In fact, not only does he confront it head on and doesn't simply say it was neither his sin nor his parents' sin, but rather said, God wants this because he wants God's power to be seen. So he's saying that this man's misfortune is there for God's purposes, which is even like in our own thinking, like, why in God's name would God do that? Kind of thing. But again, there's an old adage that comes from the scriptures itself. God's ways are not our ways. And that we even have a hard time with that. So that when someone in our own experience, and here's a spiritual reality for us to contemplate a bit, when misfortune comes into our lives, or someone we care about or love, or if we look at the world and we see, I'll relate this personally in a moment, we ask the question, why, or we can ask, why does God allow this? Or we can even ask, why is God doing this to me or to us, and so on. We kind of get this idea that God is moving us around on this giant chessboard and somehow afflicting us with these nasty things. Well, this particular passage is a remedy for that in our own spirituality, that God doesn't do these things to us. These are the things that happen in life. This is particularly true when we begin to reflect on our mortality, that we die. We're born, but the opposite of birth is death. And we all have to die. We have to die somehow. And so, we pray for a peaceful and happy death. That there's a long-standing tradition within the church that goes back to the 13th century, the days of the Black Plague, where death was all around, where, we didn't pray not to die, we prayed for a happy death, because we didn't want that awful, awful, painful kind of death, that we just wanted to be able to sleep away, kind of thing. That, death is inevitable. It's going to happen. But the manner of death becomes the desideratum, in a sense, so that, live a long and purposeful life and then sleep away. That's going down a rabbit hole. But the point is here that Jesus is already upending something. So that's one point you're making, George. There's another point here, that the Pharisees then got this thing about, how can something good come from someone who does what we judge to be evil? Namely, breaking the Sabbath law. It's basically our rule, but we don't think it's our rule. We think it's God's rule. And we know it to be one of the commandments, keep holy the Sabbath, but we have instituted all of these human regulations around it, the Talmudic regulations, and now he's broken those regulations. Therefore, by breaking the Talmudic regulations, he's broken the divine command, and in breaking the divine command, he must be a sinner. And obviously, a sinner cannot do the work of God. Therefore, this healing can't be God's work. The logic of that is clear to the Pharisee, not so clear to us. So, we begin to think in terms of moral quality here. On the other hand, there are those who study the science of ethical and moral development within human development. There is a level of ethical and moral development within human nature where rule orientation is the rule of the day. Remember, there is a time in life where we are instructed, keep the rule and the rule will keep you.
That's why Maud would say, God will get you for that.
It has me thinking about Solomon and how and human nature, and how people, even today, I mean, friends of mine, some are much more rule oriented and go by the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. And when I'm hearing this story, I kind of think about Solomon, and I think, why aren't the Pharisees thinking about that example of someone who obviously was empathetic and clever and was going on the spirit of the law by not having this baby torn in half or cut in half to appease the two women, to find a clever solution like that. So part of me thinks that these Pharisees may just have, more or less, were just looking for an excuse. What can we get Jesus on? And let's look at it this way and back it up with our laws.
But then we can look at our own contemporary situation and begin to realize that even within the Christian church, very often we can get caught up in this very same kind of.
I was about to say that I've been in another group, and that's why I couldn't go to your presentation, even when I was very interested. And we're discussing a book in which the writer talks about how we can conceive of God as someone that, if we follow all the right rules, will provide for us. Like a parent who will say, I train my kids to go to church and to do the right thing. Why are they involved in drugs? I did all the right things before God, and yet something is not working here. And so that's a conflict. That's a moral conflict that is very real.
Right.
For many.
Right. That there is a kind of recipe book for salvation and for wholeness. That if I follow this recipe, like baking, there's a difference between, and sometimes I've used this analogy, all analogies limp and fail, but there's those of us who like to cook, there's cooking and then there's baking. Cooking, there's a lot of wiggle room in cooking. There's no wiggle room in baking. Baking is a precise science because it's all about chemical interaction. Having the right balance of, bicarbonate and all this kind of stuff, that's what makes things rise and all that sort of thing. Baking has to be fairly precise. Where cooking, you can a dash of this, a dash of that, and you stir it up, you taste it, and we'll put some more of this in, those kinds of things. Not that I'm going to say that moral living is that imprecise, but it's definitely not baking in the sense that the day-to-day conduct of life presents so many different variables that one cannot predict with the kind of precision that is necessary, like a baking recipe. Because the point is, in a baking recipe is if you leave a particular ingredient out, you can predict what's going to happen. Whereas in a cooking recipe, you can almost like, if you leave the salt out, you can add salt at the end. It won't taste the same, won't be as great, but you can still kind of fix it. You can't do that if you leave baking powder, say, out of a baking recipe. It just won't rise. See, I'm getting at there. I'm trying to do it too quickly, but those analogies, I think, when we start, but see, a total rule orientation to Christian living is more like saying that our relationship to God is like a baking recipe. If you do the following things and you do them in the following order and you tick off all the boxes, that God will be pleased. And that is essentially Pharisaic understanding of our relationship with God. It's total rule orientation. And while there are large swathes of Christianity who would reject the Old Testament as salvific, they have in fact adopted the Old Testament viewpoint. So that while they will espouse salvation by grace and faith alone, they in fact, in terms of the living out of that, have adopted a modality which is purely Pharisaic. That you must do this, this, and this in the proper way in order to get into God's good graces. So while they would reject the understanding of salvation by works, I have at least one good Lutheran that I'm looking at here, that that in fact, many of those who espouse that position actually end up in that position, almost because they are rejecting it, they end up espousing it. Therese.
That reminds me of people I know who are into the prosperity gospel idea, and they seem to almost have this attitude that if people aren't doing well in their lives materially, it's because they've done something wrong, they've failed.
Right, that's exactly true. So rather than the whole blindness thing, in terms of a physical ailment, we can see that obviously if you're not prospering in life, there must be something wrong with your moral quality. And so the idea is, if you want to prosper, get right. You hear this language, get right with God. Mm-hmm. That's what you hear, on the Joel, I'll name it because it is so prevalent in our society, particularly in the United States, the Joel Osteen channel, it's got his own channel now, that's what you can hear the language. It's like, if you want that happiness, that material happiness, get right with God morally. And you're not only him and his church, but there's a whole movement that is like that. And that is, I think, and I would name it, and I would be happy to argue with anybody who is in that position. I believe that is heretical. I think that is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But it is a form of works in that sense, that it's a Pharisaical approach to the gospel of grace and fits neatly into this dialogue that's going on in this gospel. Because then all of the inconsistencies that seem to be popping out of this narrative are in that particular viewpoint. What else in this particular narrative kind of stands out?
The Pharisees continue to be deaf to the sighted man's testimony. And he has to repeat himself. And then, the way I read it, he gets to be sort of a smart aleck. like, if you don't believe me, do you want to be a disciple and hear it from the horse's mouth? I mean, which of course gets into a little bit deeper trouble, but it's like you testify and testify and testify, and these people don't want to hear what you have to say.
Have you ever heard the phrase, there are none so blind as those who will not see?
It's will not, yes.
So it's not a matter of the physical capacity to see, but the moral will to see. And boy, all we need to do is look around us today. You know, you can have a political argument, you can have a theological argument, you can have any number of different discussions around the Thanksgiving table these days, you know, and present any number of quote unquote facts. But if it doesn't match one's narrative, it's not true.
My mind is made up. Don't confuse me with the facts.
Facts, yeah. All kinds of things like that. But see, but what we're seeing here is that it's not unique to the current situation. This is part of human nature. Is that we can go into a situation where they question the parents. And they say, is this your son who is allegedly born blind? And they say, yes, this is our son. Who would know that it was really their son but the parents, right? Then they're going to doubt they'll doubt the fact that this is their son. And then once they give some sort of incontrovertible proof that this is their son, then, well, he must not really have been born blind. You know, there's always that alternative. This is a more modern take, you know, more recent thing. Alternative facts, you know, where there must have been a different set of facts that you are not accounting for, or that you are ignoring, or that you are hiding from us. You know, you can continue to come up with this, again, long before the current, political, philosophical debates that we've been having over the last several years. I did this as a thought experiment because this was happening, 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. I did this little thought experiment among my colleagues in my graduate housing. I said, there is no such place as Idaho. Now, I was resident in a graduate building on the campus of Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And I said, there is no Idaho. It's a figment of your imagination, and it's all a scheme of the US government, because you see, Idaho has 2 senators and 1 representative in the House, because then you have 3 government officials, and you can skew government bills. And I came up with this very elaborate scheme by which this was all meant to control the government. And because no one really lived in Idaho, or so I said, and you couldn't prove to me that anybody lived in Idaho. And see, the way that this works is, here we are in Washington, D.C. Of course, once in a great while, you would see someone and they say, well, yesterday, they would come up and say, yesterday I saw a license plate, somebody from Idaho, a visitor or whatever. And I said, that's part of the government scheme. They had those made and put on a car just to prove, try to get you to think that they were from Idaho. There's always a way of explaining the fact away. And so it's kind of this human way of doing just what George said. I've already come to this conclusion. Therefore, there's nothing you can say to dissuade me from this position. And so when we're reading this gospel lesson, we're getting a little bit of insight into that. And so we get into this notion of, within John's gospel, of the hard-heartedness that Jesus is confronting. And the hard-heartedness John ascribes to, quote unquote, the Jews. Okay, but what we must always be careful, now we're getting into the whole Holy Week narratives and so on, is not, when we're talking about the Jews, we have to be careful. This is a translation issue, that we might be better to avoid the true issue of anti-Semitism, which emerges from John's gospel very strongly. That's just a warning, because of the way this has been translated for a very long time as the Jews. I would suggest, when you see that phrase, that in your mind's eye, you see it as the Judahites. The Judahites. Because these are residents of Judah, the southern kingdom. And what's going on here is that they are afraid. These are the people who are afraid that this Jesus movement is going to bring down the wrath of the Romans and wipe away the kingdom of Judah. They're afraid they're going to lose their political autonomy. And so, because they might lose their political freedom, their political autonomy, and they're the ones in power, they're the political party in power, that they're going to lose their political power. They don't want this Jesus person to disrupt that. When does Jesus become a problem for them? When suddenly who starts to follow? The people.
And
When he is, go ahead, Carmen.
we begin to recognize in what we have been talking about that, as you have pointed out a couple of times, it's human nature. We can be a Pharisee without that title very easily.
Mhm.
We all have been there at some point with some ideas.
Mhm. And again, when Jesus starts to side with whom, very often, what did we talk about a couple of weeks ago? This notion of the preferential option for the poor. And who is usually seen as the poor? Those who, we just said it a moment ago, who are living in sin. They're the ones who don't follow the Torah law, obviously. See, in the Pharisees' mind, they're the ones who have broken the law. That's why they don't have any power or money. Because they're at the, that's why they're at the edges, the margins of society. Because God is judging them. So when we are opting for them, they become a threat to those of us who are righteous by the law. Because you're saying, oh, God likes sinners? If God likes sinners, God might start to bless them with our money, with our power. And who's the one who's telling them this? It's this Jesus person. So we need to cut this serpent's head off now. Tom.
Part of this gospel that I like is sort of the other end of the stick here, so to speak. During the all the interrogatories that the Pharisees put the now seeing man through, their doubt, their entrenchments, very obvious, their frustration. But then on the other end, you see this now seeing man go from referring to Jesus as a healer and later a prophet, and then finally Lord.
Yes.
So you see the growth in his acceptance of Christ as the person who saved his eyesight and got him to see.
And because he begins to see. Now we can see this from a physical point of view, and then take it even deeper, just as you did, that it's not only that he has been restored physically, but because he can now see, he has now been restored. He's no longer a beggar. He can become a productive member of society. He is no longer shunned because he's no longer obviously a sinner, an unrighteous one. He is now part of his own community again. All of the healings that Jesus does, essentially, whether it's if we did all of the book, what's called the book of signs in John's gospel, of which this is one of those elements, is to restore the one healed into full membership of his or her community. And that's a piece of it. And it's that sense of restoration that is also the bugaboo with the Pharisees. Because Jesus is moving people across class lines. Whether it's the lepers, who are the most obviously they're the most obviously cast away. And now they're being restored to their family, to the synagogue, back to full participation in society. So now this is one of those situations where, as I think, was it you, George, said, or somebody said, the whole thing is being turned on its head. And that's a dangerous place to be. And now this man is not only seeing physically, he's also, this little journey that he's taking, he's having a physical, intellectual, and moral conversion. So in a way, he's providing the model for us, how our lives change, and gives us what the theologian that I quote so often, Bernard Lonergan, calls insight. So notice that this is also the place where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Again, John uses this wonderful interposition, or juxtaposition, I should say, of light and darkness. Because he says, we have to work while it's light. We can't work in the dark. And then what does he say? I am the light. Implication being there's coming a time when it will be dark. Well, I will be taken out of the world. And we know what that's going to be. Not yet in the gospel lesson, but that's coming.
And what you're saying is very difficult to do. Because in this case, this man is in a way in conflict with what the parents have said, who do not want to be on any side in particular. So how much of that will he lose? And how much of the sense of community he has had so far as a Jew have been lost? So it's not an easy position.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking about one movie that had been in the news recently, Women Talking.
Mm.
And it's really about a reflection of women of the of a Mennonite community or Amish community, I'm trying to remember, that have to reflect on what to do after one of them was raped. And the men of the community tell them that they have to forgive and forget.
Right.
And they get together to talk about what would that be. And the only solution they could find was to give up on their community and begin a new life on their own with their children.
Yeah, well, and to think about even that particular, and I haven't seen the movie, but I've read about it. And the manipulation of that is an amazing thing, because one of the core tenets of Mennonite faith is the idea of forgiveness and peacemaking, but how that's being manipulated by the power of the men, because they're saying, you know, the core of our faith is forgiveness. But then what they're doing is manipulating the women by that to escape accountability for their own evil. So that the debate among the women is which of those values, I mean, they're being told that that by reporting them, they're not forgiving. Actually, it's a both and. Their choice must be a both and from a moral point of view. They must forgive, but that doesn't mean that they cannot hold them accountable. But the result of holding them accountable is being shunned by the rest of the community. And so their choice is where the difficulty comes in. And that also shows the corruptibility of the community, where if they are shunned by the community because they hold someone accountable for evil, and that the notion of forgiveness is a lack of holding someone accountable. See, and that goes back to, even our own idea, we can reflect on it for ourselves, the notion of, going to confession and say, that we ask for forgiveness of God for sin, but the idea of not doing penance for our own sins, God forgives us, but it does not mean that we are not held accountable for our sins. Forgiveness does not mean that. Forgiveness simply means that God does not hold our sins against us. It does not mean that God does not hold us accountable. We have to do penance. There's a wonderful scene. I remember it from back in the early 80s when Ali Aja shot John Paul II. And John Paul II went to the prison and met with him. Now, this is the guy who tried to assassinate the Pope. And the scene there was a photograph in Time magazine. And the story was about John Paul II actually having a conversation where he forgave, personally expressed his forgiveness to Ali Aja, but that didn't spring him out of prison because he had committed a crime. And the punishment for his crime was his prison term. Forgiveness does not do away with punishment. See, that's something we can't quite wrap our heads around. That's a difference between being pardoned, like we talk about politically about pardon power and all that kind of stuff. Pardoning presumes guilt. When someone accepts a pardon from the President of the United States, it's an admission of guilt. Because you can't be pardoned from something you didn't commit. But that's why when the priest stands at the altar and pronounces pardon and absolution from all your sins, we are accepting the guilt of our sins. But then asking God for forgiveness. And the forgiveness, that's what the absolution is. It's the forgiveness. The pardon is given, but that's different than accountability. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, what we're saying is, I didn't do it. See the difference there?
So that's when the priest says to the confessor, 3 Hail Marys and don't do it again.
Mhm. It's a sign by accepting the penance.
Yeah.
One says, yes, it's a modality of saying, yes, I accept that I have done this. I accept accountability for this thing that I have done. And, sometimes because we don't practice that very often in our own church, we kind of skate over it. Like, we don't accept a whole lot of accountability for a lot of what we do.
Yeah.
I
That's
think,
very easy to do. I'm sorry, go ahead, Judith.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry. Go ahead, George.
go ahead. Well, but we're stuck in this conundrum all the time. And we think of forgiveness as something that is gracious and lets the other guy off the hook, perhaps, but it doesn't, and that's hard for us to accept here and anywhere, that we remain accountable for what we have done, and we should consider that very seriously, or pray on it, or whatever it will require to make us whole again, because we have done something wrong.
And there's the key. There's the language that's important: to make us whole again.
Yeah.
That is the healing portion. That's what Jesus is doing in this particular story, is making this man whole. He was blind. We sing this when we sing Amazing Grace. I was blind, but now I see. So it wasn't, I was in Amazing Grace. That's the notion. That's what grace does. We were spiritually blind. I could not see my sin, but now I do. Now I acknowledge what it was that was keeping me from this full life of grace in God. But now I do, and it no longer is an obstacle for my living out this relationship with God. So that's what this man is saying. And Tom's observation that he went from being a man who was physically blind and had all of these physical obstacles to being a man who now was physically sighted and no longer had the physical obstacles, to being a man who now was able to be grateful for whoever did this nice thing for him, to go the next step and realize that this person who did this nice thing for him did it for a higher purpose, and that higher purpose was to convince him and others that he is the Messiah, the Lord. And so he accepts that reality and worships at his feet. So his sightedness, his wholeness is made complete. He goes from being a broken physical creature to a whole spiritual creature. So this process of healing is made complete.
And that was in part what I was going to say about the fact that we didn't really, well, we talked about it in a different way. The verses after the blind Pharisees drove out the sighted man. Now he would have been shunned by the whole community, even though he wasn't blind anymore.
Mhm.
He wasn't sinful for some reason. And then after they threw him out, Jesus sought him out. He didn't immediately go running back to Jesus, but Jesus sought him out.
Well, he couldn't run back to Jesus because he didn't know who Jesus was.
So Jesus sought him out to further his the man's
His healing process, his becoming whole.
Yeah.
Jesus is the good shepherd. He's the one who searches. Again, that's a theme in John 2. Jesus is the one who searches. I come not to condemn the world, but that the world might have life. So that, that one paragraph that you just are talking about there, that dialogue that goes back and forth and back and forth, you do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We don't know where he comes from. That's a problem, isn't it? Because we don't know that this is the Son of God. We don't know that this is the Word, the Logos. We don't know this. Well, but we see his works. See, and that's the idea again, that it's the works that testify. It is what I do that testifies. And that's a constant theme in the book, in the Gospel of John. John has these, what are called the book of signs, that these signs are what testify. Don't take me at my word, see what I do. Because there are many other prophets, false prophets, who have all these nice words, but they don't do the work. Do the work. See the work. And that's the test of a prophet, even in the Old Testament, that the work and the words are one. And it's interesting that the man himself, the blinded, the man that is now sighted, goes from, again, as Tom said, he comes to see him a prophet, and then as the Messiah. The fact that he uses the word prophet says, yes, his words and his actions are one. That process is an important piece of this, this developing understanding, this sightedness, this insight into who Jesus is. And this dialogue between the Pharisees and the sighted man is a key element here, that one paragraph. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but we don't know that God has spoken to this one. Well, but we, look at what he does. What sinner could do this? Of course, in another place in John's, in the gospel, we hear about, well, of course, he could be Beelzebub who does these things. It's that whole back and forth about that.
I don't know where different things fall in the Bible. I apologize. But wasn't it on the Sabbath again that Jesus healed the man by the pool who
Yes.
could not get into the water? Well, how can you do this? Why are you doing it on the Sabbath? And again, it's the Pharisees that are there judging him.
Yep. And it's the sacrality of the Sabbath, that Jesus again is turning everything on its head, because it had all become corrupted from the point of view that God's law, and St. Paul teaches this very clearly, that the Sabbath was to be a teacher, to teach us the fundamental values of God, not the other way around. So the way Jesus puts it is, man was made The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In Matthew's gospel, he says this. Whereas, so the whole idea of the law, the Torah was put there to teach us the values of God, that we might align ourselves with these values. That's Paul's thesis. That the law is a teacher, a stern teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. And once we get the values right, then we don't need the law anymore. And so when we begin to, and Paul's thesis is, if we get the value, if the Pharisees and the teachers of the law would get the values right, then they would see, all of a sudden, they would see that that's what Jesus is all about from the get-go. And the law falls away, so there's no need for the whole, Jewification, as it were, of the Gentile. Because if they accept the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of the gospel, then there's no need to go through this notion of creating new Jews in order for them to accept Jesus as the Messiah. Because if they accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and all of the values that Jesus taught as gospel through the Gospels, then then there's no need for the law. That's how he makes the leap into the whole Gentile mission. But this notion of, this idea of light is, one of the major themes in John. Remember, going back all the way to Christmas. There was the light, and the light was the light of men. And this is where we get this notion of, there are none so blind as those who will not see. And it's a theme that we have to remember and recall, in our own lives as well, when we are confronted with things that are outside of our own paradigms, particularly in our religious training, that sometimes we have to question ourselves to say, oh my, is this beyond the pale? Is this something that is more than I can accept? Why is that? Now, that doesn't mean simply because it makes us uncomfortable that it's true. God gave us brains, gave us the gift of reason.
Yeah.
We have to think it through. And that's what discernment, going back to our presentation on Tuesday night, was about. That's God gave us the gifts to discern what is true and right and reasonable.
That's different than to spend your life studying the law.
Yeah.
So that you can out-argue somebody. And the genius of Jesus is when he says, when he answered, which is the greatest commandment, and he says to love your God with all your heart, all your mind, and your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. On this hang all the law and all the prophets, which must have really hit them right in the eye, but sums up all of what our problems are with the way the Jews were living and are living concerning the law.
But then George, when he says that, doesn't the teacher say, the other teacher says, you have spoken rightly, good teacher. But then he says, who is my neighbor? And we get the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah.
So there's always that next step.
And
That's always, there's always the deeper, there's always the deeper. There's always the next step. And that's all, just to point out, that's always the mystery. There's always more. There's never the fullness of the answer.
Yeah.
We've never got it all. Ever.
That's, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to complicate with this story, but going in that direction. I was part of a church in which one of the children of this couple accused the father of sexual abuse. And they were both members of this congregation. And apparently there was truth to the story. But this is a church that tried to live the words we have been saying, loving God and loving our neighbor, to the point of the church being, even when it was a white church, yet it was planted in the middle of one of the poorest parts of Nashville.
Mhm.
On purpose, to serve a Black neighborhood and to be part of that community. And there were all kinds of things done with, and all kinds of groups working with the community. And not just Christian, but Muslims, Jews, anybody was welcome. So you could be joining hands with someone that didn't smell too good, but they were part of the community and they were welcome to the church. So it was a challenge. How do you handle that? What do you do with this accusation and loving both? And the decision of the church was, we want you to keep coming to church. We want you as part of our congregation. But we want this man, when he's near children or young people, to be with some other adult.
Right, there are ways of doing that.
Right. We
And
want you to
yeah.
participate fully, but we would like for you, we want you, if you're working with children or young people, you are not on your own.
Right. Well,
And I was resented by some.
of
Oh, that's
course.
not loving. But the church stayed in that route. No, it was not that we were not loving him. It was more protection for him and for other children in the
But that is the loving thing to do, you see. It is the loving thing to do, to not to place anyone in harm's way, including the perpetrator, from the point of view that if the possibility that they might perpetrate again, you want to do everything to prevent him from perpetrating again, both for the protection of the young people in their midst, but also for their protection, to keep them. Don't think of it in terms of that. Think it in terms of substance abuse. If somebody is a substance abuser, you don't simply push them out of your community. You don't stop. Say it is somebody who abuses alcohol, and you're in a community that appreciates the balanced use of alcohol. You don't not serve alcohol ever again because there's one person in that community that doesn't have that abuses alcohol, but rather you prove, like we have a policy in our church. We adopted it at vestry. We don't serve hard alcohol, and we serve only beer and wine, and we always have an equally attractive non-alcoholic alternative, so that we make every opportunity for that person not to be tempted, and that other person not to feel put out because they might abuse drink. It's those kinds of things. There are ways of doing things that are loving and do not put people on the spot and do not put people in harm's way in such a way that they're excluded from the community. Excluding people from the community is almost never the answer, unless it is such a situation where there is no other way of taking care of the problem. If there are alternative ways of taking care of the problem, then exclusion is never the answer within the Christian church. That's what excommunication is about. That's why the whole question of shunning and all that sort of thing is such a difficult thing. And it is too often used within the church. And I'll say that, in the context of central Pennsylvania, I think, within our, conservative Mennonite communities and so on, it is too often used, and it causes such deep traumatic harm to people. Now, on the other hand, there are people whose own, personal lives, there's deep trauma that is triggered and so on by the presence of other folks, and those kinds of, that's a whole different question, and that all has to be addressed. And these things are never simple or easy to address, but we can try to do it the best way we possibly can, with as much expertise as we can muster. And there are a lot of resources available to do those kinds of things. Any other insights? Insights, not a word used lightly in this particular lesson, in terms of this particular text. This is a big one. There's a lot of stuff here. This, we could go on and on and on for weeks on this one. But we just sort of we skimmed over the top parts.
The idea of blind and light
Mhm.
was there that we never got into, but it's a very important part of the Gospel of John.
Mhm.
Jesus as the light of the world, and the blindness, physical and spiritual.
Yeah, we go all the way back, and I made a couple references going back to the prologue to the first chapter, which we read at Christmas time. In the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word, and so on. That then the question of light comes up, so that light is actually an ongoing theme. One of the things, again, this gets that a little granular, but even the parallel expressions, I'll just point one out, for example. Let me find it real quick here. And who is he, sir? Tell me that I may believe him. Jesus said, you have seen him, and he is the one speaking to you is he. And he said, Lord, I believe. Who does that sound like? You hear it again.
Oh,
Show me the sign, show me his hands and his side, and I will believe.
Thomas.
Thomas, here it is. Put your finger here. Lord and my God, I believe, it's there. This is a phrase oft repeated in John's gospel in various points. Show me, again, who is he that I may believe? Mary, Rabboni, Mary hears his voice. She thought he was the gardener, and she sees him, and she mistakes who he was, and finally turns and sees him, and she again suddenly sees him for who he is after the resurrection. That's in this gospel too. See, so there are these different ways in which suddenly there's mistaken identities. There's suddenly people begin to see who he is. There's this whole idea of manifestation, of epiphany, that we don't get any epiphany stories per se in this gospel like that, but we do get these manifestations of Jesus in these different ways.
And in this case, the case of Joseph was darkness, quiet by themselves. With the Samaritan, we begin to see more people involved in the scene.
Yeah.
But this is a whole scene in which many characters participate at the same time, different levels. They're all seeing the same thing, but the interpretation of what happened is very different.
Yeah.
Which is very complicated.
And if you notice, as Mother Mary's been trying to put these dialogue, gospel stories together, as we've been living out the dialogues, it's been more and more challenging for her, because we just had a few people in the first one, and some more in the second one, and then some more. This one is going to involve practically half the congregation when you get all the parts, played out. So, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, of course, what's going to happen? But Palm Sunday, we've got the biggie, and there is this, and you almost get and there's a method to that madness, actually. When we discussed doing this, there's this building up to that most dramatic of stories in the Passion narrative, where you have all of Jerusalem adither, with this dynamic story going on. Judith and Therese, what Mother Mary's been doing is these stories, rather than just having the priest or deacon read them as stories, they have been actually dialogically or dramatically presented. So it's like, and there's no narrator. The only thing that a narrator does are the scene setting things. There isn't a she said, they said. They actually have characters speaking to each other as dramatis personae type thing. So they're almost like a play being acted out. And it's been phenomenal. Interestingly, people have come up and say, because she'll have a plea, I need a few people to do X, Y, Z. And people have come forward and that you would never expect. Say, I'll do that, or, do you need somebody? Because they've said it's impacted them. And it's been marvelous. It's been a marvelous experience for the people. And so
we all know people. We all know people who, when you explain something to them that's important, their first words are, yes, but.
Yeah.
And so this is a story about yes, butters all through the whole thing.
Yeah. So it's been marvelous. And I think this is going to be one of those very, this story familiar to everyone, but hearing it played out with different voices and different people, it's going to be impactful in a way that people maybe will hear it for the very first time in a way they've never heard it before.
You can have a whole lot of Pharisees, each asking a question. Maybe a whole gang involved there.
Well, I'm actually Pharisee 1 at the 5 o'clock service. So I get to be a Pharisee for a change. It's always interesting.
I will be a Pharisee too.
Oh, there you go. It's interesting how they almost always make the priest into Jesus, at like the Passion narrative and things like that. It's almost like I want to be somebody else. It's just...
I hate being the people when we do the Passion narrative, and the pastor is Jesus and somebody is Pilate. I hate being one of the people yelling, "Give us Barabbas."
Well, 'twas ever thus. There was the crowd, the leaders of the crowd. That's what you did, and then you all shout, "Crucify him!"
Yes.
There was a one of the most effective presentations. I have to say this, of the Passion. I was fairly newly ordained, of course, being the young priest on staff. I was only 26, 27. Of course, immediately, young priest on staff, second level curate. Who gets the youth group? Hello, me. So I had the CYO. I was Catholic priest at the time, and so I'm the advisor, youth advisor, and at that time, CYO was still in the throes of doing one-act plays and all kinds of things like that. And we decided we would do a pantomime presentation of the Passion. So it was fully narrated by one person. And boy, was there furor in the parish, this Catholic Church. So, I sort of weathered the storm with that. We adjusted their costumes. We took the red off their eyes. So, because they were, clowns, and there was all this kind of stuff about, clowns. And well, I can tell you the people who were most critical were the most moved by this, quite frankly. The kids did a marvelous, marvelous job, but the most moving point, there were two moving points. One was when the crowd shouted, "Crucify him." And the other was the actual crucifixion, when one of the young men of the parish, high schooler, stood up. We had this sort of paper mache rock on a platform and so on. And he had his hands extended up like this against a cross. And, pantomime is extreme gesture. And so the kids who were doing the nailing, there were two of them, one on either side, had this long sweeping gesture from the ground up. And someone back in the loft, in the gallery in the back, they had planks that they slapped together as, the sound of nails being driven. And the impact that had on the congregation, grown men crying, just, again, the sensory impact of that was, and to this day, I'm sitting here like starting to well up a little bit, just the reflection of that. And then that's, just the impact of that alone. But watching a congregation of 1,100 people witness this, that sometimes we don't give enough credit to the way we communicate the power of Scripture in the way that we have received it. And that these stories are just that, they are stories. And they need telling. And it is the way that we tell them that give them power. So that is really, where we as a church, as community, and as individuals have our power as well in the world, is to tell our story to the world. So as we tell these stories, like about the man born blind, about the woman at the well, and so on, and as we go into Holy Week in a couple of weeks, we have a great responsibility, as well as a great privilege of telling this most wonderful story. As they titled a movie many, many, many years ago, "The Greatest Story Ever Told." So thank you for your morning. We'll see you again next week, where we will tell even a greater story. They build over Lent. We had the woman at the well with water. These are the themes of Lent in year A. The theme of light and being and vision and insight. And next week, the raising of Lazarus. So we'll see you then.
And for Judy, I like your voice is getting better and better.
It's better in the morning than later